In 1567, between the towns of Rugby and Brownsover in England, a businessman named Lawrence Sheriff founded a grammar school for boys, which he called the Rugby School. And according to stories passed down through the generations, in 1823, a 16-year-old boy at the school named William Webb Ellis, during a soccer game, which of course they called football, William picked up the ball and ran with it, breaking the rules, but also at the same time creating the game of rugby. So in 1850, near what was then a very new University of Virginia, there was a school that was built, and it was named in honor of the historic school in England, the Rugby School. And the road leading out to the school was called the Rugby Road, and it connected the University of Virginia out to this new school. And right along that road would be one of the university's first athletic fields, where this new game of American football would be born.
In the 1850s, American football was in its infancy. College students played the English association football, or soccer, but gradually Americanized it with their own rules.
What we call college football actually began as a soccer kicking game. The Eastern colleges dribbled the ball and kicked goals. So the resemblance to American football was almost non-existent, yet it was called football.
You can really start to see the beginnings of what we call football at the University of Virginia in 1870, when we hear reports of students playing the kicking style of football. And there's even some reports that there was a football game in 1871 between the University of Virginia and Washington and Lee, though we don't know what the score of that game was. That's sort of lost to history.
The fact that those two teams allegedly played in '71 is incredible because, as you know, there weren't many programs in the country at that time.
From 1869 to '71, only 3 schools were playing intercollegiate football. The University of Virginia may have been the 4th, but with no historical records of the game, it could never be proven. Over the years, more colleges began playing until the sport would make a giant leap in 1874, when McGill University of Montreal challenged Harvard. McGill played British rugby using a slightly oblong leather ball shaped like a watermelon. Harvard would take the game to Yale, and they too agreed that rugby was superior to the association game. And it was rugby that Yale freshman Walter Camp played and fell in love with.
Walter Camp was an accomplished athlete, but also a rules maker. And while he was still at Yale as a player, he introduced several important rules.
Until 1880, there were no plays. There was nonstop action until a score was made. Neither side had time to devise strategies other than a helter-skelter attack. Soon, more rules were added. Players were reduced from 15 to 11 a side. A line of scrimmage was established, and to prevent teams from running out the clock, Camp installed a set of downs, forcing the offense to give up possession after failing to advance by a certain distance.
And thus, American football was born.
In November of 1883, at the University of Virginia, a formal football club was organized with a constitution and elected officers. The UVA literary magazine described the game as throttling one's competitor and violently throwing him to the ground. Progress was slow. Few students understood even the rudimentary facets of the game. But in the fall of 1887, 2 new UVA graduate students joined the club. Medical student Charles Wilcox from Yale and law student Richard Reed Rogers from Princeton saw the success of the football programs at their alma maters and wanted to bring their knowledge to a part of the country with no intercollegiate football.
The University of Virginia was the first, and at the time the only, football team in the South. So they didn't have anybody to play. But thank goodness there was a local prep school called Pantops Academy. And according to the historic record, they both played valiantly to a scoreless tie. And that was the first game at the University of Virginia.
Excitement over the game grew, and a rematch was scheduled. This time on the UVA grounds for March of 1888. The historic first touchdown was scored by quarterback Herbert Barry, and the University won, 24-0.
The first game that the University of Virginia ever played against another college team was in December of 1888. And they played Johns Hopkins. Regrettably, the University of Virginia lost that first game 26-0. But you know what? It didn't matter. They had the bug, and they were ready to play. In the first few seasons, the University of Virginia players wore silver gray and cardinal red. And of course, that was in tribute to their relatives who had died during the Civil War and worn the Confederate uniform. And of course, silver and red together was symbolic of the gray colors that the Confederates wore that were stained with blood. The only problem was the red dye in the uniforms, when it mixed with Virginia red clay, it ran and it turned pink.
Well, my great-grandfather was Alan Potts from Richmond, Virginia, and he apparently was a great athlete at the University of Virginia. When they decided to change the colors, they had a big meeting of the student body. And he was late because of being at football practice. But when he came in, he had a boating scarf that was orange and blue, which he had received the summer before when he studied in Oxford and was on the rowing team there.
The story goes that during the meeting, somebody sitting near Alan stood up and grabbed his handkerchief
And said, well, what about the orange and blue?
and everybody said, that sounds great, let's go play football.
So this is a fragment of the silk boating scarf used by Alan Potts in 1888. So this is your great-grandfather's.
Right, gosh, this is the first time I've ever seen it. I've heard about it for many, many years. But yes, and Alan Potts, who was my great-grandfather, gave part of it to Stuart's, to
My
your
grandfather, right.
John Stuart Bryant. I mean, I understand that you're
Jonathan Randolph.
Jonathan Randolph Bryant.
He was on the team. He and your great-grandfather were all at Virginia together.
Gosh, I thought the color, the orange and blue, that's the colors of UVA now, were more the colors of Stuart's tie.
Well, you can see down here, the edges, the frayed edges, shows a much brighter orange and what
It
it
sure
was
does.
closer to what it would have
Yeah.
been.
Well, I always heard the reason they changed their colors was because nobody could see the colors after they were muddied on the field.
Aha,
Well, I'm glad to see the original.
I am too.
Thank you.
We're pleased.
In the early days of UVA sports, the players were known as the Rebels.
It wasn't that far removed from the war between the states, and so I guess that was a natural moniker for the team.
But that changed when they adopted the orange and blue and had these uniforms with these orange and blue stripes on them. And some newspapermen referred to the University of Virginia players as the Tigers. In the early 1890s, you would hear at some of the games a battle cry in the stands, Wahoowa, and that got shortened to Wahoo or Whoos.
Yeah, the origination of the term Wahoos is, we've heard so many different stories, but we do know that the first time anybody on record mentioned it was a baseball game, a hotly contested baseball game with Washington Lee, who was a huge rival for Virginia in those days, and their fans apparently were poking fun or trying to rile the Virginia people and started calling them Wahoos. Or Yahoos, we're not quite clear, but somehow Wahoos derived from that, and history was changed.
Do you know how they got the name Cavaliers? In one of those games in the teens, they were playing Harvard, and one of the Boston newspapers on Sunday morning wrote a story about how polite the Virginia players had been in helping up the Harvard men, and called them the Virginia Cavaliers. I always liked that story.
It wasn't until 1923 when the students sponsored a contest for a new school song that one of the students came up with the Cavalier song. Now the song has sort of fallen out of favor, but the lyrics of the University of Virginia being the place of the Cavaliers has stuck and continues into this day. So in 1890, the University of Virginia team decides they really want to get in the big leagues, and they want to take on some powerhouse teams from the north.
And they were feeling like that, hey, let's just test our mettle, see how good we are. They were eager to find out how they stacked up against the true powers of college football back then.
So they arrange a doubleheader, and they're going to travel up to Washington, and on a Friday, they're going to play the University of Pennsylvania. And then the following day in Baltimore, they're going to play the big Princeton team, arguably the best team in the country. So this was really UVA's coming out weekend. Here comes the UVA football team.
Didn't turn out so well.
Well, on that Friday, they lost to Penn 72-0. The next day, they travel to Baltimore, Oriole Park, and they take on the Princeton Tigers. They lost that game 115-0.
They were pounded by Princeton and Penn, and it wasn't pretty.
Well, I'm sure they were surprised by the level of competition. I think that it's almost like a pro team taking on a college team.
I guess they realized at that point they had a lot of work to do and a lot of improvements to make in the program before they could be competitive against the best teams in America.
But again, they came home fired up and excited because they had played Penn, they had played Princeton, they had met these powerhouse teams on the gridiron, and UVA football was off and running.
After its inauspicious start, Virginia took a new direction. If you can't beat them, hire them. So in 1892, UVA employed its first coach, William Spicer, a halfback from the Princeton team that had beaten them 2 seasons before. Spicer's boys would go on to a relatively successful 3-2-1 campaign. The following year, the team turned toward another Princeton player, a relative of former UVA student and poet Edgar Allan Poe. John Poe guided the squad to an 8-3 season, winning their last 5 games by a combined 138-0. With 2 victories to open the next season, Poe's Virginia men were on a 7-game winning streak. The next contest would be a rematch against defending national champion Princeton, only 4 years after their 115-point embarrassment. Under Poe's direction, Virginia showcased its rapid ascent as it played tough in a 12-0 loss. Days later, UVA would face their other opponent from that doubleheader weekend, the Penn Quakers. Losing 14-6, Virginia was one of only 3 teams to score on 12-0 Pennsylvania that season. In 4 years, Virginia accomplished a dramatic turnaround, but its significance would not lie solely with wins and losses. The program was about to begin a long and momentous influence on the sport itself.
Wahoowa, The History of Virginia Cavalier Football, is now available on DVD